Morning and hello everybody. We left Bridge, but I'm hoping I'm still coming through clear. The pleasure to start the third day of the conference. We have 2 days behind us, so it was really exciting and good sessions. So thank you for coming again. And we start the day with the session on the living labs. My pleasure to introduce Agriculture Canada in 2021. And he is the climate change lead. He held several positions with Environment and Climate Change Canada's Climate Research Division since 2010. And the working much up in other. Hand it over to you, Kevin. Thanks for joining us and have a great.
Thanks very much, Roland. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen right now. You were coming in a little bit choppy through there, so I'm not sure if that's my connection or yours. So I'll just, if I am choppy, okay, so you can hear me okay then.
Yep, and we Perfect. Can see your screen.
Great, thanks very much. Again, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the conference organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to everyone a little bit about agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's various Living Labs programs. Before I get into my presentation, I have to take a second to just say, Roland mentioned that prior to joining AFC in 2021, I spent just over 10 years at Environment and Climate Change Canada, including about 1.5 years total that I lived and worked at ECCC's Atmosphere Monitoring Observatory on Ellesmere Island, which is actually the same lab that was mentioned by one of our previous presenters on Tuesday. Corb Whale mentioned that he had worked there as well. And I have to say that this is the first time I've ever presented at a conference or a meeting of any kind where I'm not the only person to have worked at that lab. So pretty small world. I also want, before I start, just to acknowledge that I'm joining from the agricultural hotbed of Toronto, Ontario. But on a serious note, that Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So with that, I'll take a second just to give a quick overview of my talk today. I'm going to start by giving an overview of what I actually mean by Living Labs, and then I'll go into detail about 2 distinct programs that AAFC has funded involving the Living Labs approach. I'll talk about our Canadian Agro-Ecosystem Living Labs network and a little bit about some Living Labs collaborations outside of Canada. So I'll start by explaining what exactly we mean when we talk about Living Labs. So many in this audience have probably heard about Living Labs and maybe even participate in one or know someone who participates in a Living Lab. And we've already heard references to various Living Labs over the past couple of days of this conference. So the first thing that I'll say is that Living Labs is not a program per se. It's not something that the Government of Canada or Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has kind of invented or put in place. I really like to think about it as more of an approach, a new approach to innovation and research that we're using in this context to deliver a particular objective. And I'll also say that Living Labs are actually used in other areas of innovation and research. It's not just an agriculture thing, but of course, in our case, we're focusing on agro-ecosystem Living Labs. The key defining points of an agro-ecosystem Living Lab are that it involves producers, researchers, and other partners working together right from the beginning to co-develop innovative solutions. So in our case, we're talking about beneficial management practices, or sometimes they're called best management practices. I'll refer to them just as BMPs. And the reason why we do it this way is to increase the likelihood and the speed at which adoption of these BMPs takes place. So it's all about, it's all geared towards adoption here. I think that we often get trapped into this sort of false thinking that science has essentially already solved all of our problems, and all we need to do is really roll out the solutions or implement the BMPs in the case of agriculture. And that's really not the case. So Living Labs is really a new approach to innovation and research. It's kind of, I often think of it as another tool in the toolbox. And rather than scientists working, in the lab or on experimental farms, coming up with potential solutions, publishing the results, and then years or sometimes even decades later, these solutions kind of get picked up and implemented at the farm level. In the Living Labs context, we have producers and researchers working together from the beginning to co-develop solutions that have the best potential, to deliver the solution and work for everyone, and to accelerate the adoption process. There are three core principles around which agroecosystem Living Labs are based. So one is user-centered innovation. Again, this idea that it's really focused at the ground level, at the user. Working in partnership, so we don't have people kind of off on their own developing a solution and then just laying it out and say, here, go and do this, and a focus on the real life context. So that's not to say that we're throwing away the lab or throwing away the experimental farm, but a core, a defining principle of Living Labs is that we're starting from the real life context. We're not kind of bringing it in as an afterthought. So in our agroecosystem Living Labs programs, we typically follow a fairly similar format in terms of how Living Labs are structured. Each Living Lab is led by one lead partner, and that's typically, but not exclusively, kind of a provincial level producer association. But in fact, we heard yesterday that Mistawasis Nehewak leads the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky Living Lab under the Agricultural Climate Solutions Program, which is our first Indigenous living, our first Indigenous-led Living Lab. So there are other partners involved, but it's Mistawasis is the lead on that Living Lab. So the lead partner also brings in a number of other partners on board with their Living Lab. They're typically other producer associations, Indigenous communities, not-for-profits, NGOs, and academic partners. And this network of partners engages producers, farmers, ranchers who participate directly alongside the researchers in the Living Lab. And of course, there's a significant role for federal researchers in the Living Labs co-development process. And in our agroecosystem Living Labs, this is typically scientists from AAFC, but we also have involvement from other government departments. And of course, I mentioned we have significant involvement from many universities and colleges across Canada. So what makes these labs living is really this innovation cycle. We don't just develop a potential solution in a lab and then communicate it out to practitioners. All of the players are involved in the co-development process to generate ideas and potential solutions. These are then tested both in the lab or experimental farms, but most importantly on real working farms to get that real life context. And then we evaluate the BMPs that we co-develop. And we don't just do this for one cycle. Another defining point of Living Labs is this iterative nature of the innovation process. So we're not just looking to develop some new BMPs or make some enhancements to existing BMPs in sort of year one of a project, and then just focus on implementing these solutions for the rest of the project. The co-development process is ongoing through the life of a Living Lab. And having all the stakeholders involved allows a Living Lab to do this kind of iterative, continual assessment and improvement of solutions every year. Typically, we're, in agroecosystems, we're on a year scale with growing seasons. It could be longer and shorter depending, as I said, if your Living Lab is in a different context. So co-development is a regular ongoing process in the innovation cycle. And the key is that this process is user-centered. So the producers are central to the process. We typically see kind of a combination of formal organized events and communications complemented by informal meetings and conversations. And we've heard this week about how important this role of knowledge transfer is in general, but especially in a Living Lab. It's really a key component of the Living Lab approach. The co-development process ultimately has to enable decisions to be made within a living lab, and it can also be adjusted from one region to the next. So the co-development process on a living lab in Manitoba might look quite a bit different from the co-development process in a living lab on Prince Edward Island. So that's how our living labs are typically set up, and a bit of a look at the all-important co-development process. I mentioned at the start that what sets the living labs approach apart from other ways of doing research and encouraging innovation is that our end goal is to enhance adoption of these BMPs on farms. So in order to do that, we focus on the overlap of these three key elements when we're trying to co-develop BMPs. First of all, they must be technically feasible. So you have to actually be able to put these practices into play on farms. Of course, they must be economically viable. And we've heard a lot about this aspect too over the course of this conference. And going back to our initial keynote, maybe there are other ways that we need to start thinking about how to value typical total farm outputs beyond this, our sort of usual idea of economic viability. But the reality is that it's still very difficult to engage farmers if we don't address the economic side of this equation. So the economic viability is also a key factor. And finally, the solutions we develop, they must be desirable in terms of the human and the social context. So that's kind of your crash course in what a living lab is and how we are applying it in the agro-ecosystem context. So I'm going to talk about now two programs at AAFC that are using this living labs approach. And I would say kind of pioneering this living labs approach, certainly for the agro-ecosystem living labs in Canada. So the first is the Living Laboratories Initiative, which started in 2018 and is actually coming to a close at the end of this month. This program involved living labs in 4 provinces and focused on using the living labs approach to develop BMPs that target really a wide range of agri-environmental challenges. So water quality, soil health, pollinator habitat, many others. And in part due to the success of this original Living Laboratories initiative, AAFC moved forward with a second program, which started in 2021, which is called the Agricultural Climate Solutions Program. And this is, again, taking this Living Labs approach to develop BMPs that are specifically focused on enhancing carbon sequestration and reducing greenhouse gas emissions on farm. And the last thing I want to add to not to lose sight of this is that this idea of socioeconomic studies are core really to both of these programs. This effort to understand what influences adoption of BMPs, whatever those BMPs happen to be targeting, understanding that adoption through socioeconomic studies is a core to both. So here we are in March 2023. We have our original Living Laboratories initiative coming to a close, and we currently have 9 living labs in 6 provinces under the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs program. And by the end of this year, we anticipate having living labs in all 10 provinces under the newer Agricultural Climate Solutions program. So not too much to get hung up on between those two programs. It's really the difference in kind of the fact that Agricultural Climate Solutions is really targeting these BMPs that sequester carbon in agricultural soils and reduce on-farm emissions. And both, as I said, both use the exact same approach, which we've been over: the innovation and research, the 3 key principles, that idea of ongoing co-development, all the way leading to adoption and ultimately a long-term impact, which is reducing, or not reducing climate change, but kind of mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change, as well as the other environmental co-benefits that we're incorporating into the BMPs that we're developing. At this point, I hope I've given you a bit of a better understanding of the concept of a living lab and how we've applied this approach to 2 different programs. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to kind of go into a little bit more detail about the individual programs. So AAFC, as well as other government departments, as well as many obviously outside of government, have recognized that urgent action is needed to accelerate the response to climate change. And so AAFC's role is specifically towards agri-environmental challenges in agroecosystems. So starting in 2018, AAFC launched a network of living labs to help accelerate the development and adoption of sustainable practices and technologies on Canadian farms. And the Living Laboratories Initiative focuses on a number of different challenges, specifically adapting to climate change, reducing water contamination, improving water and soil conservation, and maximizing habitat capacity and biodiversity. And I gave a few examples kind of under all those categories on the previous slide. So the first group of living labs under this initiative were developed in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Prince Edward Island. I won't go through this table row by row here, but I just want to highlight a few things. One is the various agri-environmental priorities that were addressed through these 4 different living labs and the regions that they covered. So you can also see the lead partners for each of these living labs here. And it's sort of a continuation of this slide. Again, I'm not going to go through in detail, but I just want to give you a sense of the size of these living labs, both in terms of the partners, the participants, and in terms of the number of different BMPs that were co-developed and tested through these living labs. And again, it was, in large part due to the early success through this Living Laboratories initiative that AAFC decided to kind of continue with the Living Labs approach and apply it to the new Agricultural Climate Solutions program. So before we move on, I want to take a few minutes and just highlight a few specific outcomes from 2 of the living labs under the Living Laboratories initiative. So Living Lab Atlantic, which was primarily on Prince Edward Island, had a focus on investigating the potential for precision agriculture on the island to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, minimize nitrogen loss, and reduce economic and environmental impacts. So they developed quite a few information products on the multiple environmental benefits of specifically some of the water retention projects that were developed through this living lab. And obviously this slide really doesn't do justice to everything that came out of that initial project. So if you're interested in kind of seeing a bit more detail about this or the other living labs that I'm going to mention, all of these web references, the URLs that you see on these slides will be put in the chat, so you can use them as direct links there. One of the key objectives from Living Lab Quebec was to look at riparian buffers and the impacts on soil health and water quality, biodiversity, and productivity estimates. And similarly, you can find a lot more detail on the other outcomes and what they did in Living Lab Quebec on the Union des Producteurs Agricoles website. Again, it's pretty small on my slide. I apologize that, but if you look in the chat, you'll be able to find these links and use them directly here. So in 2020, the Government of Canada announced the Natural Climate Solutions Fund. This is a $4 billion program that's really focused broadly on leveraging nature-based climate solutions in Canada to address multiple aspects of climate change. And so the Agricultural Climate Solutions Program is essentially AAFC's part of this bigger Government of Canada Natural Climate Solutions Fund. The program itself has 2 components: the Living Labs program, which I've mentioned, and we'll talk a bit more in detail here, and the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, or OFCAF, as we typically call it. So OFCAF provides direct support to farmers to adopt BMPs that store carbon and reduce greenhouse gases in 3 target areas. So it's a bit more of it's a direct support to kind of adopt BMPs from a menu, if you want to think about it that way. Whereas the Living Labs component, as I've described, is focused on co-developing new or improved BMPs and enhancing the overall adoption process. So the next slide, I'm going to take 2 minutes to show you a video that gives a good overview of the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs program here. And if I've done this right, you should be able to hear the sound coming through on this, but if not, please give me a signal and we'll just move forward. The link where you can find this video is also in the chat there.
Farmers and scientists know the impacts of floods, droughts, and fires, which are becoming more frequent. Climate change is one of our greatest challenges, but there are solutions, and the Canadian government has set a clear goal to cut emissions by more than 30% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Indeed, farmers are stewards of the land, and in collaboration with Canadian scientists, they are well positioned to provide some of these solutions. It's why the Agricultural Climate Solutions Program was developed, a new program to help harness the natural power of the soil to store carbon and keep it out of the atmosphere. It will help develop effective, practical, and economic solutions to help combat climate change. Agricultural Climate Solutions will use the same collaborative on-farm approach used by the Living Laboratories Initiative. It will create collaboration hubs including researchers, agricultural associations, farmers, environmental organizations, indigenous groups, and others. This collaboration will lead to the co-development and sharing of sustainable farming practices. These practices have the potential to trap and store carbon on farms, reduce greenhouse gases, improve water and soil quality, and protect the diversity of soil organisms, plants, and animals on farms. Because of this unique on-farm approach, environmentally friendly innovations suited for today's agriculture can be tested and deployed quickly to farms across Canada. Be part of a powerful nationwide network that will deliver the right solutions across the country to help farms and Canadians. This program is for agricultural industry associations, not-for-profit organizations including cooperatives, and Indigenous groups who are working in collaboration with producers. Be a part of Agricultural Climate Solutions.
Okay, so that hopefully kind of summarized a lot of what I've been talking about, the linkages between the two programs, and really moving forward with the new focus with the agricultural climate solutions. So the program is being implemented in two phases, and this is related in large part to the fact that the Living Laboratories Initiative was already underway in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Prince Edward Island when the Agricultural Climate Solutions Program started. So I won't spend a lot of time here other than just to flag this fact that ACS started in 2021, and the proposals for phase one of this program came from BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland and Labrador. And so the first 9 agricultural climate solutions living labs in these 6 provinces were announced by Minister Bibeau, who is the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, last July, just towards the end of July. So that's a picture of Minister Bibeau at an event in Calgary, I believe, where she made the formal announcement. And so these groups have been engaged in the co-development process and are really ramping up for their first full growing season in their living lab. So a lot of kind of, the fall and winter of last year and this year were spent preparing, bringing on partners, bringing on producers and participants, and getting ready for this year's first full growing season of being an official living lab. So by the end of this year, as I mentioned, we expect to have a full network of living labs across all 10 provinces under the Agricultural Climate Solutions Program. So I'm going to just take a couple of minutes here and focus in on a couple of our ACS living labs specifically. And again, given that this year will really be the first full year, full growing season where the living labs can start testing BMPs, a lot of them, pretty much all, are still very much in the early stages here. So for those who participated in yesterday's session, you already have heard a little bit about the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky Living Lab from Anthony and Melissa. And as I mentioned, this is our first Indigenous-led living lab, and they're focusing on engagement and relationship building for Living Labs co-development with First Nations producers and partners, taking an inventory and mapping of First Nations agricultural lands and activity, And Anthony, I talked a little bit about this yesterday as well. Melissa mentioned this idea of using bundles of BMPs for cropland enhancement, which again is, came from the co-development, the innovation process that Bridge to Land, Water, Sky has been doing within their living lab already. Marginal land restoration to regenerate grasslands and wetlands as grazing lands, and measuring and modeling BMP impacts, as well as knowledge sharing and communication. Just as another example, Alberta is one of the provinces where we have multiple living labs under the first phase within the same province. So the Alberta Agri-Systems Living Lab will develop BMPs in 6 areas, including crop rotations, cropping systems, land use changes, grazing management, livestock feeding, nutrient management, and increasing carbon on the whole farm. And just as a highlight of some of their specific projects are to assess new or refined BMPs on their ability to sequester carbon or reduce emissions, identify barriers and find solutions regarding adoption of BMPs. So again, this is that all important kind of socioeconomic study to understand what influences adoption of these BMPs. Conducting farm level, regional, industry level economic analysis of BMPs, develop simple outcomes and system-based approaches for producers to quantify the cost benefits, and share accurate on-farm measurements of carbon sequestration and GHG emissions. Ultimately, this is all done to inform policy on the effectiveness, economics, and adoption of potential BMPs, and to build a producer-oriented mentorship network. And so that's the kind of thing, that ties into this whole idea of adoption and co-development and bringing on partners, right? There's a lot of different ways, from sort of formal knowledge sharing activities to these mentorship networks that a lot of different living labs are focusing on as well. So we've had a bit of a crash course on what a living lab is. We've looked at some examples from the 2 specific programs that are really employing this living lab context. And most of the focus so far has been at the individual living lab level. So what is a living lab? What goes on within a living lab? How do they work? What are we kind of aiming this process at here? So for the last few slides, I want to kind of move up a level or two and talk a bit about what we're doing more at a network level, both within Canada and with other partners around the world who are doing similar work in the agricultural context. So within Canada, we have what we call the Canadian Agro-System Living Lab Network, or CALNET for short. And at the heart of it, the network is primarily made up of participants from our network of living labs across Canada, but network membership, if you want to think of it that way, is not strictly limited to those who have a formal role in a particular living lab. We do have some network participants who aren't formally part of any of the living labs, but who have an interest in continuing and contributing to the overall work, as well as leveraging the data and information coming from the living labs. So for instance, we have modelers who are interested in modeling activities across different regions in Canada and who interact via CALNET with multiple living labs teams. I spent a lot of time talking about the living lab approach, the co-development process, and how all of this is designed to fast track the adoption of new innovation. And the idea of CALNET is to help take this process to the next level by providing a mechanism for the different living labs across Canada to learn more from each other. We know that Canada's agricultural landscape is varied from one region to the next. We have different microclimates, soil types, and even different social and economic contexts across Canada. In terms of practices, what works in Alberta often won't work in Nova Scotia, and not the same way. So notwithstanding those differences, there is a lot that we can all learn from each other in terms of knowledge sharing, data collection, communication, and the innovation process in general. So the idea of this network is to really kind of leverage all the individual living labs for sort of that communal benefit and really build strength in the network of living labs across Canada. The network is organized around different working groups predominantly. There are some specific working groups aligned to agri-environmental themes. So we have soil health, water, agrometeorology, biodiversity, and the crop health and productivity groups. And then we have some cross-cutting that really kind of span a few of these different themes. And those ones include our modeling and geomatics group, our data integration, our socioeconomics, and the innovation and knowledge working group. Again, the membership is typically comprised of Living Labs participants, but that's not an absolute requirement. Each working group typically has co-chairs and meets regularly throughout the year. And we also have quarterly CallNet meetings where we have the entire network participates, as well as we invite some of our international partners, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. And they present on individual projects from the working groups, or oftentimes a lot of these cross-cutting missions that are going on. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, you can see from the nature of these groups, we typically have, you know, people are members of multiple different working groups, and it's all kind of geared towards, you know, a bit of the cross-pollination among the different Living Labs, and really kind of helping each other tackle some of the common challenges that we see across different Living Labs. So before I move on, I'd want to just take a minute to highlight one working group in particular, but also kind of what that working group focuses on, and that's the issue of data and data integration across this. To support the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs program, AFC has invested in, I always kind of introduce this as a first of its kind, and it sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. It really is a first of its kind data management approach that will allow Living Labs partners, both inside the federal government as well as our academic and our other external partners, to store and exchange data on the same cloud-based platform. So the idea is for Living Labs partners and researchers to be able to access data from the full network of Living Labs to answer questions on greenhouse gas mitigation, carbon sequestration, other environmental benefits, and socioeconomic challenges at that national scale. So beyond the purview of just one individual Living Lab. We've heard a few of our presenters over the past couple of days talk about data and measurement gaps specifically that still exist in terms of understanding greenhouse gas fluxes in the agricultural landscapes, and the fact that, you know, ultimately we need to be able to represent these practices in the national greenhouse gas inventory. And so over the long term, you know, the ultimate goal is that Living Labs, especially the Living Labs under the Agricultural Climate Solutions program, would really be able to add quantitative data on these BMPs that are being developed and tested, so that they ultimately do end up contributing to the national inventory. So the cloud-based platform that we've developed will allow partners within a Living Lab to securely store and share data with each other. And as I said, the long-term goal is ultimately we want to extend this so that Living Labs data can be shared across the full network of Canadian Living Labs. But it really is, you know, it is for those who have worked with data with government partners before, you will be, you know, familiar with the pain of securely sharing data from one group to the next. So this is really a first of its kind, and it's a solution that we're very excited about within the Living Labs program specifically. So I mentioned before, we're at a very interesting point in terms of agroecosystem Living Labs in Canada. We have 4 projects under the Living Laboratories Initiative that are winding down, while those Living Labs under the Agricultural Climate Solutions program are really just starting to take off. And even for those Living Labs under the initiative that started in 2018, it's really a relatively short time period when you think in terms of the agroecosystem, you know, changes and benefits that we're really hoping to bring about. So it's a little bit early to get too reflective right now, but I do think it's worth taking a couple of minutes just to look at some of the early outcomes and lesson learned here. So one of the big challenges here is this idea of the culture of innovation. And if I've convinced you of nothing else, I hope I've convinced you that Living Labs is really a totally new way of kind of tackling this question of research and innovation. So we're hoping, and we've seen in some of the early Living Labs greater motivation to exchange ideas on refined tools and strategies and practices, and increased engagement through these co-development activities. We've seen a lot of sort of interconnections and interactions that we probably wouldn't have seen from more of the classic ways of going about research in this context. We've seen an enhancement in the relevance of research. So this user-centered approach ensures high relevance of the supporting research, right? Like, again, taking back to my first example, rather than having the scientists kind of work away in the lab and then just put out their results, hoping that they'll be adopted by practitioners, by farmers, by producers, we're really getting that working together from the ground level to try and make sure that the research that we're doing is relevant to the end user right from the beginning. And finally, the resiliency of networks. So some of the we've seen some of the relationships built through these Living Labs have created stronger ties and solid linkages, again, among kind of different groups that maybe we wouldn't have seen that under the again, the sort of more classic approach to research. The lessons learned is kind of a I guess a different framing of what we just talked about here, but it's not to say that there aren't challenges. There definitely are. It is a really new way of working, both for researchers and for producers, for farmers. It takes a lot of courage and being a progressive player to kind of put your hand up and say, yes, I want to be part of the solution. I will invite our academic and our government research partners to actually set up some systems and make some measurements on my farm while I'm trying to earn the profit and go about my business as I usually do. That's asking a lot, and it's asking a lot of the researchers. They're used to kind of setting up their experiments the way and doing all the replicates and all that. So it's bringing these kind of two groups together, and it's not easy. But the whole point of this is that at the end of the day, it's a new way that will hopefully really increase adoption. And so we're developing a new way of working. We're putting a lot of new partnerships and collaboration together, and really learning new ways of communication and coordination in this frame of reference. So the last thing that I'll leave you with here is just a few words on our collaborations outside of Canada. So we've really, we've kind of gone through this idea of what is a Living Lab, where we are in Canada within our Living Labs and our network of Living Labs. But we're also plugged in, and there is a lot of similar work, sometimes exactly called Living Labs. Sometimes it's kind of branded a bit differently, but at the heart, it's still very much that Living Labs concept that's going on in other areas around the world. So this is again, I won't go through line by line, but this is just kind of an idea of some of our key partnerships that we're working very closely with on Living Labs and Living Labs related activities, I'll say. And the one thing that I do want to point out, and it's not to kind of toot our own horn, but I do think it's important that really within the sort of international Living Labs community, Canada is really looked at as more than just a partner, but as a real leader on agro-ecosystem Living Labs. And we are seen that way by a lot of the international partners. So before I close off, one of these partnerships in particular has led to what is going to be the first international forum on agro-ecosystem Living Labs. So this is going to be held as a side event to the Adaptation Futures 2023 conference in October, which will be at the Palais de Congrès in Montreal. This conference, the Adaptation Futures Conference series, is really the premier international conference devoted entirely to climate change adaptation. And it brings researchers, policymakers, practitioners, industry reps, and communications to present their work on adaptation and discuss emerging and cross-cutting issues here. Now, AFC, I mentioned those partnerships. One of our key partners is with INRAE in France, which is essentially France's National Institute on Agriculture and Environmental Research. So we are co-hosting the first international forum on agroecosystems living labs, which will occur over 3 days of that week-long Adaptation Futures Conference. And it's going to be an exciting venue for knowledge exchange, specifically on living labs work all over the world. And you can see on the slide here at the bottom, we're still accepting proposals for the forum until March 3rd. I believe the call for proposals for the Adaptation Futures Conference itself has closed, but for the International Forum on Agroecosystem Living Labs, that call for proposals is open until March 30th. So I'd encourage anyone, specifically in this audience who's interested, to take a look at the conference website, and that link there will give you sort of the direct line to the International Forum on Agroecosystem Living Labs. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. We've got about 20 minutes, a little bit less, for questions. And I'll also flag that I will be participating in the barley sandwich session later today. So if you have any other questions about Living Labs in general, or some of the specific Living Labs projects that we're doing here within Canada, I'm happy to talk about that a bit.
Evan, you do have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
There we go. Thank you. I was, despite the instructions about using the Q&A and not the chat, I got a little bit lost in there. Okay, so we have a question. Are there descriptions of the new Living Labs and what they are working on your website? You presented an example for Alberta Agri-Ecosystems. I'm looking for information on Regenerative Alberta Living Lab. The answer is yes. So there is, and I'll copy and paste again the direct link here for everyone. There is kind of an overview for it gives you basically the list of the lead partners, the funding involved, and the key objectives of those 9 initial projects within the first phase of the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs project. I can't remember if our site, and when I say our site, I mean it's an Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada site, if that has direct links to the key partners, but you can see who the lead partner is, and then you can find often, even for those who are kind of just getting off the ground running, they have a lot more information on their own respective website about the Living Lab project. So I'll get those, I'll get that link posted, and then you can find the lead partner and find some more information there. So are there or will there be tax credits to incentivize for growers to help support the use of their land? For some of the projects, there is a disruption of farm operations, and it might help if growers are compensated. So I mentioned the OFCAF program, so the On-Farm Climate Action Fund program. That program is more geared towards that direct support to farmers to implement sort of a smaller targeted list of BMPs. In the Living Labs program, it's a different approach. It's not that idea of funding, but it's an excellent question and excellent points in terms of the fact that, you know, I mentioned that it's a new way of working kind of for all of the parties involved, and certainly for farmers, for growers, for producers. You know, to be honest, it is a disruption to their land. So the other thing I'll just say on that point and close it off is that because of the way the program works, I mentioned that, you know, we essentially have a lead partner for every living lab. Some of the lead partners are kind of looking at that issue and, you know, how to compensate the participants, whether it's, you know, monetarily or otherwise. But it's not from AFC's perspective. It's not like a uniform kind of funding calculation, if you will, in the way that the on-farm climate action fund is.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you so much, Kevin, for coming here and talking about the living labs. And as mentioned, we have, after the last panel this afternoon, another barley sandwich session for hangout and chatting. So you can find Kevin there if you want to bug him with more questions about the living labs, and he would be immensely happy to answer whatever question you have